Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. Ryan had always been an ordinary man, a seasoned mercenary. Sure, but no legend. He fought battles because it was the only life he knew, the only life he had ever wanted. There was no grandeur in the life of a mercenary, only blood and coin. And Ryan had earned plenty of both over the years, but never enough to stand out in a world full of heroes, warlords, and monsters. He was neither extraordinary nor worth remembering. That changed the day he found Solmar. The battle had been fierce, more so than Ryan had expected. His company had been hired by a local warlord to fight a rival kingdom, the kind of conflict that mercenaries were always dragged into, but cared little for. As long as the gold was good, Ryan didn't ask questions, but this time, things had gone wrong. The enemy had come prepared, and Ryan's salmon were being cut down faster than they could retaliate. He stood in the middle of the carnage, his sword heavy in his hand, blood dripping from its edge. Around him, the cries of dying men echoed like a dirge, the stench of death thick in the air. Ryan's breath came in ragged gasps, his body aching with exhaustion. Victory seemed impossible. His comrades were falling, and it was only a matter of time before the enemy overwhelmed them. That sign when he saw a sword lying in the dirt just a few paces away, glowing with an eerie, pale light. It had belonged to a fallen warrior, one Ryan didn't recognize. The man had been wearing robes, not armor, and wielded strange magic in the battle. Ryan had watched him unleash a torrent of dark energy, killing soldiers with a single word until he had fallen himself, cut down by an arrow to the throat. Now the sword lay abandoned, its handle blackened and twisted, its blade pulsing with a strange otherworldly glow. Something about it called to him, a whisper at the edge of his mind, promising power. Ryan hesitated only for a moment before his hand reached for the hilt. The moment his fingers wrapped around the sword, a chill shot up his arm, and a voice, a low guttural whisper, slithered into his mind. "Take me." Ryan's heart pounded in his chest, his hand trembling, but he couldn't let go. The sword felt right. It felt like it belonged in his hand, and when he lifted it, he felt a surge of strength unlike anything he had ever known. His fatigue vanished, replaced by an intoxicating rush of power. The enemy charged at him, but Ryan moved before he even had time to think. The sword seemed to guide his hand, cutting through armor, flesh, and bone with terrifying ease. The blade sang as it sliced through his foes, leaving behind nothing but bodies and silence. Ryan fought with a ferocity that stunned even himself, the enemy falling before him like wheat before the sky. But it wasn't just his body that felt different. Something in his mind had shifted too. As the sword cut down enemy after enemy, Ryan felt a strange sensation as though their very essence was being pulled into the blade. He could feel them, each soul, each dying breath, trapped within the weapon. When the battle was over, Ryan stood alone, surrounded by the dead. His comrades, his enemies, all gone, and in his hand, Solmar pulsed with a faint, cold light. The whispers in his mind, growing louder, more insistent. "You are mine now." Ryan should have been afraid, should have dropped the sword and run. But instead he felt only exhilaration. The sword was his. Its power was his, and with it, he would never be ordinary again. Weeks passed, and Ryan became something of a legend among the mercenary band. Wherever he went, battles ended in his favor. He was invincible. Soldiers who once fought alongside him now looked at him with awe and fear. He was no longer just another mercenary. He was a war god, undefeated, unstoppable. But with each victory, the whispers in his mind grew louder. The souls trapped within the sword were not silent. They cried out to him, their voices tangled together in a chaotic chorus of agony and rage. At first, Ryan had tried to ignore them, focusing only on the power the sword gave him. But the more souls the sword consumed, the more difficult it became to push the voices aside. He began to hear them even when he wasn't holding the sword, their whispers clawing at the edges of his mind. They told him things, dark things, terrible things. They showed him visions of the lives they had lived before the sword had claimed them, their memories bleeding into his own. Ryan's dreams became nightmares. He saw the faces of those he had killed, their eyes hollow and accusing, their voices pleading for relief. But there was no release. The sword held them fast, and through it, they held him. He tried to resist, to regain control of his mind. But the more he fought, the more the sword tightened its grip on him. His thoughts became clouded, his actions more violent, more erratic. He could no longer tell where the sword, Cecil, ended and his own began. And still he fought. Battle after battle, Ryan led his men to victory, his sword cutting down all who stood in his way. He felt invincible, like a god, but with each soul he absorbed, a piece of himself was lost. His memories began to blur, faces and names slipping from his grasp. He couldn't remember where he had come from or why he had started fighting in the first place. All that remained was the sword and the blood it demanded. It wasn't too long before Ryan's sus men began to notice the change in him. They whispered among themselves, casting wary glances in his direction when they thought he wasn't looking. They had seen him fight, seen the way his eyes glowed with an unnatural light, the way he seemed to move with a speed and strength that no human should possess. They had seen him speak in voices that were not his own, voices that echoed with the hollow emptiness of the dead. But they didn't dare question him, not yet. Ryan's rise to power was swift and brutal. He became a force of nature, a legend spoken of in hushed tones across the land. No one could defeat him. No army could stand against him. Kings and warlords sought his favor, offering him wealth and power beyond his wildest dream. But Ryan no longer cared for wealth or power. All that mattered was the sword and the blood it demanded. He had lost himself completely, the man he once was, buried beneath the weight of the souls he had claimed. He no longer saw his enemies as men, but as vessels, their souls ripe for the taking. He reveled in the slaughter, the screams of the dying fueling his madness. The sword whispered promises of eternal glory, of power beyond comprehension, and Ryan believed it. He had become a god in his own mind, and nothing could stop him. But the more souls the sword consumed, the more unstable Ryan became. His grip on reality began to slip, his mind unraveling under the weight of the voices that clawed at him day and night. He saw things that weren't there, heard voices that didn't exist. The faces of the dead haunted his every step, their hollow eyes following him wherever he went. Ryan no longer slept. The nightmares were too much to bear. Instead, he wandered through the night, his sword always in hand, ready to strike at the shadows that seemed to close in around him. His men watched him from a distance, fear and suspicion growing with each passing day. They no longer saw him as a hero, but as a monster, a man possessed by something far darker than any of them could understand. Ryan's descent into madness was a slow, agonizing process. The once sharp lines of reality blurred into a twisted haze. His enemies were nothing more than shadows to him now, hollow figures with voices that taunted him, pleaded with him, cursed him. He heard their whispers even in the stillness of the night, heard them call out to him from the depths of the sword. Each soul, trapped and writhing, made his mind a battlefield of its own. Sleep had long since abandoned him. Instead, he wandered in a fog of delirium, haunted by the faces of those he had slain. The mercenaries who had once followed him with blind loyalty began to question his sanity. They watched from the shadows, whispering among themselves, fearful of the man who had once been their leader. Ryan noticed their sideways glances, saw their fear, but he didn't care. Their lives were meaningless to him now, nothing more than fleeting sparks in the grand inferno that was his destiny. The sword had promised him power, and it had delivered, but at a cost he hadn't foreseen. He was no longer just a man. He was something more, something darker. The turning point came on a bitterly cold night when Ryan led his men into battle once more. This time, the enemy was a rival warlord whose lands bordered Ryan's newly claimed territory. The warlord had heard of Ryan's growing madness, had heard the rumors of the cursed sword and the man who wielded it with terrifying skill, but he had underestimated just how far gone Ryan truly was. The battle was brutal as always, but Ryan moved through it as if in a trance, his blade carving through flesh and bone with eerie precision. His enemies fell before him, their souls screaming as the sword devoured them. The voices in his head grew louder with each kill, a cacophony of pain and anger that threatened to overwhelm him. But Ryan reveled in it. He fed on their fear, their hatred, their anguish. He was a god of death and the battlefield was his domain. But then something shifted as Ryan swung the sword toward yet another foe. The man's face changed. For a moment, it wasn't an enemy before him. It was one of his own men. The young soldier, barely more than a boy, had been with Ryan for years. He had fought alongside him, bled with him, but now Ryan saw him as an enemy, a threat. The sword urged him on, whispering that the boy, Saul, was right for the taking. Ryan hesitated for only a fraction of a second, but in that moment, the boy's face twisted into one of horror. He raised his hands in surrender, but it was too late. The sword cut through him like butter, and the boy's scream was swallowed by the night, as his soul was ripped from his body. Ryan blinked, staring down at the boy's lifeless form for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The fog in his mind cleared, if only for a brief moment. He saw the blood on his hands, saw the terror in the faces of his men as they realized what he had done. He had killed one of his own. But the sword didn't care. It pulsed in his hand, hungry for more. The voices rose to a deafening roar, drowning out all reason, all humanity. The faces around him blurred, became indistinguishable. Friend, foe, it didn't matter. They were all the same, now all souls waiting to be consumed. He screamed, a raw, guttural sound, and lashed out at the nearest figure. His men scattered, some screaming his name, others fleeing in terror. Ryan did not care. He was lost, consumed by the sword's insatiable hunger. He cut down anything that moved, the battlefield becoming a slaughterhouse. The sword thrummed with power, each new soul adding to the chorus in his mind. He was drowning in them, suffocating under their weight. By the time the battle ended, the ground was slick with blood, and the bodies of his own men lay among those of the enemy. Ryan stood alone in the center of the carnage, the sword still clutched in his hand, its glow fading as the last of the souls were consumed. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling with exhaustion. He looked around, but there was no one left to witness his madness, no one left to stop him. The whispers in his mind had quieted, but only for a moment. He could feel them waiting, watching. They would return. They always did. Ryan fell to his knees, his hands still wrapped around the sword. His body ached, his mind frayed and broken. He had become a monster just as the sword had promised, and now there was no turning back. But in the distance, beyond the battlefield, he saw something, an old, crumbling temple, barely visible through the fog of war. A flicker of memory stirred in the back of his mind. He had heard tales of this place, a sanctuary where warriors came to rid themselves of cursed weapons. The sword Estelle whispers grew frantic, urging him to turn away, to leave this place behind. But something inside Ryan resisted, some small, broken part of him that still longed for relief. With trembling hands, he rose to his feet and began to walk toward the temple. Each step felt like a battle, the sword itself growing stronger, its grip on his soul tightening. The voices in his mind screamed at him, but Ryan pressed on. He had to. This was his only chance, his only hope. The temple was ancient, its stone walls covered in vines and moss. Inside, the air was thick with dust, a faint scent of incense lingering from a time-long past. At the center of the room stood an altar worn smooth by the hands of countless warriors before him. Ryan approached it slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He knelt before the altar, placing the sword on the stone surface. The whispers in his mind rose to a deafening crescendo, the souls within the sword thrashing against their prison, but Ryan ignored them. He had come too far to turn back now. With trembling hands, he reached for the ritual dagger that lay on the altar, its blade gleaming in the dim light. The sword pulsed with fury, its glow intensifying as if it were trying to fight back. But Ryan held the dagger steady, his grip firm. "I release you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He drove the dagger into the heart of the sword. The blade shattered with a deafening crack, and for a moment, all was silent. The voices, the whispers, the weight of the souls, all gone. Ryan collapsed, his body shaking with relief. It was over. The curse was broken. But as he lay there, gasping for breath, a cold realization settled over him. The souls may have been released, but they had left their mark. He could still feel them, lingering in the corners of his mind, their presence a constant reminder of the horrors he had wrought. He had broken the sword, but he could never undo the damage it had done. Ryan stood, his body weak and trembling. He glanced down at the shattered remains of the sword, then turned away, stepping out of the temple and into the fading light of the world beyond. He was free, but at what cost? The man he'd once been was gone, lost to the madness that consumed him. And now all that remained was a broken warrior, haunted by the ghosts of his past. The legend of Soul Mark would live on, a cautionary tale whispered among mercenaries and soldiers alike. But the man who had wielded it The man who had once been called a war god had vanished, leaving nothing behind but the scarred remains of a forgotten battlefield.